Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in. Okay, here we go again. Welcome to Manufacturing Talks. I'm Jim Vinosky, your host, and I'm really glad to be going on this episode because it's going to be one of my favorites. I've got Aimee Ridella. Aimee is currently communication strategist with DTE Energy, but she's done a lot more than that, and she was instrumental in helping me get started with my Forbes career with some really cool stories. So welcome, Aimee.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. This is going to be fun. So yeah, like I said, Aimee, she was in PR before with an independent agency, and we'll talk about that. And yeah, fed me some really phenomenal stories here in the home state for both of us, Michigan. But we share something else, and we definitely want to cover this right away. And that is, we are both Jeep people.
Absolutely.
So that's the blue Renegade, right? That's yours.
I love it. It's way cleaner than my Jeep looks right now, but I wish my Jeep always was that clean.
Yeah, well, anyone in the northern states during winter realizes you don't keep a car looking like that this time of year. But yeah, that's phenomenal. You know, every time I see any color Renegade, I think of you, Aimee.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, well, it's just a super cool vehicle. And I like to think mine is pretty cool. So that is not mine actually, but off the web, a black Gladiator that's almost exactly like what mine looks like.
I love it. We're part of the Jeep family. And once you start, you don't go back. Once you drive your first Jeep, that's it.
I believe it. You know, they saw me coming. I've had a pickup for years and years and years, and I always wanted a Jeep, but I would have to give up my pickup. So here in 2020, they come along with the Gladiator with the pickup, and boom, had me.
Perfect.
Now I'm ensnared.
Really cool. Those are cool cars. I like the Gladiators.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love it. And like I said, love the Renegade. That's really cool.
Yes, I'm a big
Good
fan.
deal. Well, and so touched on a few things. You know, why don't you start off just kind of telling us your background and then how you got into that PR world where you and I first met?
Yeah. So, I never really knew what I wanted to be when I grew up, when I went to college and had to decide, what do I want to do with my life? I have two really math and science oriented parents. Growing up in the Metro Detroit area, they were in the automotive world, and I'm just horrible at math and science. Math was hard for me. Chemistry classes were way too challenging. So I think at an early age, my parents and I knew that I wasn't going to follow the same path that they had. I went to school and I was still having a hard time, and someone mentioned public relations and communications. Because, I'm good at writing. I like creative problem solving. I like using that side of my brain a lot. And after I took my first comms class, I was hooked, and that was it. There was no turning back.
Cool.
So, it's a fun career to have. It's a fun way to tell company stories. I really like the challenge every day of talking about complex things and breaking them down for people to understand. So now I haven't turned back. I'm a comms person now, and I love it.
All right. And so when you and I met a few years ago, you were working in the independent PR world, right?
Yes, I was at a public relations agency. So, when companies have their own maybe small PR team or even a bigger PR team, but they want some outside help or outside guidance, they come to a public relations agency and ask them like, hey, can you help us do either projects, whole campaigns, maybe just come alongside us all the time. And so when I met you, I was working on the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. That's the business side. And then Pure Michigan, which is the fun travel side.
Yep.
With a few other clients mixed in, but that was my biggest account while I was there. That's how we met.
Yeah. And so I started writing, it's actually going on 4 years ago. I think it's 3.5 right now, writing about manufacturing for Forbes. And yeah, you were one of the first PR people to get in touch with me. Yeah, it was so cool because when I got into it, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to come up with story ideas as time goes on. Well, then you came and helped out with that, which I really appreciated. And you brought me some really cool stories. Do you remember the first concept that you brought to me?
Manufacturing winter in Michigan.
Yes.
That was
Yep.
so much fun. And the best part is how I got to you. I don't know if you know this, but the reason I found you in the first place was you'd written a story on Stormy Chromers. And for people who don't know what that is, they're
Oh,
these very distinctive, like plaid hats with little flaps that come up. And they're made in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And you'd written a story on Stormy Chromers, and I was like, we've got to work with this guy. But I couldn't get a hold of you. I couldn't find your email anywhere. And in this day and age, you can usually contact someone somehow online. So I found you on LinkedIn, and I was like, hey, I've got an idea to talk about manufacturing winter in Michigan. Do you want to talk? And that was it. We've been working together ever since.
so that is amazing because I did not know that.
Yeah,
Stormy Cromer, they're made in my hometown in Ironwood.
that's
And
right.
I mean, the family and I, it's not like we're close friends, but we've known each other for decades. And so like Bob Jackwert is the owner.
Mhm.
And yeah, I remember, we went to the same church. He was one of my first guests on this show.
Yep.
And yeah, one of my very earliest Forbes articles. That is so cool. So yeah, then you
Yep.
got the Michigan and the winter tie. And so you
Yep.
brought me that phenomenal concept. So geez, I wrote about the snowmakers, the folks up in Midland who do snow machines for ski hills.
Yes.
Geez, the guy up in the UP who does handmade snowshoes.
Yep. There were the skis also, I believe.
Yep, up in
And then
Petoskey.
I think there was one more. I want to say it was a 5-part series. But yeah, I remember thinking like, oh, this guy covered Stormy Chromers in Michigan. He'll cover I think he'll like this idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
glad
yeah.
you liked it. I think I was blown away by the fact that we had snow making machines in Michigan.
I know.
That, we have snow here. I was confused.
Right.
I guess it makes sense, for the mountains. And then they made the snow at the Olympics, and I was
Yep.
like, that's just so cool.
Yeah, that was a great story.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're in Midland, which is like pancake flat too. So
Right.
go figure. That's part
Of
of the
course.
story. Look it up on Forbes if you're interested in learning why they're
Mhm.
there and why they got into snowmaking in Michigan. But yeah,
Exactly.
phenomenal folks. And you connected me up with such a great cast of characters and definitely got, some of those really early cool stories out there. So, that's kind of my end of things. And then you were tying me in with that whole, my whole career has been in manufacturing. You touched on the PR front. So how about your career? What have been the highlights for you?
Gosh, I'm not going to lie. When you said that you would like to cover a story about manufacturing in Michigan, I was pretty stoked. And then you said, yes, let's do a 5-part series. And I was like, this is the best day ever. Like, I don't want to do anything else today. My day is made. So I was really excited about that series. But I think when people talk about communications and public relations, sometimes people think, oh, a big win is always like one big article in like the Wall Street Journal, or I want to see a really big wow piece. And I think that, yes, that's amazing. But some of my favorite stories that I've worked on with people outside of you, just like other things in general, are also reaching people where they're at. And I consider those really big wins too. Like, for example, at my current job, I had a story that ran with Fox 2 Detroit that was in primetime evening news. And so, yes, that's a local story, but we're reaching the people in Detroit where we want to reach them in a primetime news spot. So I still consider that a big win. It's not the Wall Street Journal, but we're reaching the people we want to reach. So I consider that a big win. I really liked with Pure Michigan taking influencers and travel people on trips around the state. The coverage that you get from that is a lot of fun. And also, influencers are, they're newer to this world, that wasn't a career you could have years ago. And so bringing a bunch of travel influencers around the state and saying, hey, here's some content, you frame it up how you want to frame it up. That's how we work with journalists when you're in communications. But with influencers, it's all so visual, and there's all these outfit changes and all these. It's just so unique, and that was a really big win too. It was just interesting to do as well.
Yep, makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. Kind of in my experience, I've had some stories that had big viewership numbers, but some of my favorites weren't the big hitters like that. They were just the really cool stories that hit a niche and, got lots of great feedback from folks who found the cool factor in what it was all about.
Exactly. That cool factor goes a long way. And like, you
Yep.
know, I think sometimes we don't think about that. People say, oh, I want to make a big announcement on a new product. And yes, that can have a lot to do with how much, you know, I don't want to say coverage, you know, news coverage that you get from something, but
Mhm.
sometimes those really small stories are just as impactful because they're not so small because people find them interesting or, you know, they know someone who's tied to it somehow. And so it's always worth exploring. I don't want to say smaller stories and, you know, minimize them, but it's always worth exploring that path too.
Yep. So why don't we talk a little bit about what you're up to now? And then I definitely want to talk about on the manufacturing end, the opportunity that you know about that I think a lot of people might be missing around leveraging that PR world. So let's start with what you're up to at DTE now.
Yeah, so now at DTE, I do, so I went from an agency where you work for other companies. Now I'm in corporate communications. And so I just do only DTE. I do the corporate social responsibility communications. So anything that is a foundation donation, community outreach, volunteerism, all of that feel-good community work comes through me for communications and anyone else on the Force for Growth. We call it Force for Growth because we're a force for growth and prosperity.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't just do external comms. A lot of times at corporations, and I think this might be helpful for other people to hear as well, it's something called 360-degree communications. So anything that I communicate is communicated internally, externally with stakeholders. So in a full circle of 360 communications. You know, I can give you an example if it's helpful too, because I know sometimes it's like that's kind of confusing. What does that actually mean? So for example, the foundation, our DTE Foundation gave a large grant to all domestic violence shelters in the state of Michigan. And so when I look at that announcement, you have to decide, okay, well, we're going to make an announcement, but who do we want to talk to? Who are the target audiences? And so we work with the foundation to say who needs to know this information. Now, this one's a pretty, like, I don't want to say generic, but a lot of people are interested in that. And unfortunately, domestic violence impacts a lot of folks. So it's a pretty broad story and you can cover a lot of ground. So internally, we communicated it within internal newsletters, within an internal, you know, intranet page story. We did some internal videos. Externally, we did paid social media, organic social media. Then we did a press release and some, you know, pitching to reporters. If you covered stuff like that, you would have gotten it, you know, just to pitch people who are interested in that kind of story. You do some research and say, well, who does this fit with? And then also the piece that's important to remember is other external stakeholders. You know, so maybe there's legislators who would be interested in hearing about this announcement, or local municipalities might want to know about it. So what kind of newsletter can we draft, or how can we share that content with them through contacts and get the news out there? So when I say 360 communications, it is all encompassing of everything that would be used to communicate something.
Yeah, and while it doesn't necessarily fit exactly with the manufacturing world, it's a great kind of lead into, I think, what you have to tell to manufacturers who might miss out on that point of, yeah, they might be doing marketing, they might be doing advertising, but the whole PR world's really a different take on reaching an audience, right?
Yeah, it is. It's we consider it 3 buckets. It's paid, earned, and owned. So paid is, you know, paid social media, like online advertisements where you work with an advertising department. So it's paid. Earned is an earned media story where it's like working with a reporter, working with, you know, if you send it to a legislator and they tweet something, that's kind of a different way to say earned, but so someone else tells the story for you. And then owned is your own channels. So like your own social media, your own blog, your own pieces. And so I think that is important for people to remember, is that it is a different world and it's kind of a confusing world sometimes when you talk about communications, but there's a lot of options to talk about stories.
Yep. And so I found it interesting when you and I worked together, like we touched on, is I covered one story, which was this handcrafter of snowshoes up in the middle of nowhere in the Upper Peninsula. And so at the time I thought, well, how is this guy, you know, getting tied in with this PR firm? But then you were talking about the work you were doing with Pure Michigan and all that. So those are other avenues that people who may not have a big budget to spend can still take advantage of your skills, right?
Correct. So I guess that is a good point to explain, is that, you know, those that the snowshoe maker, the ski maker, those weren't my clients. My client
Yep.
was the state of Michigan.
Yep.
But we were telling the story. The whole backbone of the story is that Michigan has a manufacturing base, and it's not just manufacturing cars, although that is a big piece of it.
Mhm.
That set the groundwork to manufacture all these other things and create this creative manufacturing mindset. And so, it's working with other things, other companies to tell that story that really set that groundwork. But to your point about budget, when you talk about communications in an earned sense of working with reporters, that's free. I mean, you have to pay someone to do that work, but you don't have to pay the reporter. That's a two-way working relationship. So that doesn't come with a cost, which is really great once you figure out how to get that rolling.
I'm kind of glad you said that, because it always kind of gets past me that people might believe. So, for example, I'm reporting for Forbes, that they have to pay me for a story. And not only is that not true, that's not even allowed. I can't take money for a story. So great point. There's maybe some spending you'll do if you engage a firm like you used to work for, but you're not paying through the nose for a Forbes writer to write about your company.
Exactly. It's all free. I think the hard part is that, it takes time. Like, you have to find someone who matches your story. So I wanted to talk about manufacturing in Michigan. Happened to find a reporter who's from Michigan who talks about manufacturing, and it was a perfect fit. But, I was like, well, it's too good to be true. But, so it depends on what you want to talk about. Like, if I'm talking about manufacturing in another state, or if there's a strong business tie, maybe you want to have a business reporter write about it. So it just takes that research of saying who would be interested in this, because you're not paying them, but you want them to be interested in it because, your readership will then be interested in it.
Right. You hit on another interesting point that even I hadn't really thought about, is that knowledge you have of where to slot a story for the biggest impact. So that's another skill set that you bring to the table that maybe especially small and mid-sized manufacturers may not be thinking about, right?
Right. Yeah. It's all about the audience too. Because, if someone says, hey, we want a story on this. Okay, but who is your audience? Like, if you're announcing a new manufacturing product, I don't know what that would be, but we'll just say it's whatever it is. Maybe the audience is business to business. And so maybe there's a local business publication that you could talk to and say, hey, like, chances are that story would be interesting to them if it's got a strong business tie. And chances are the people that you want to talk to about your new product will read a business article and read a business magazine. So you'll meet them where they're at. I think that's important in communications, is to meet people where they're at. You don't want to be on TikTok if it has nothing to do with what you're talking about. And that's a bunch of 25, to 35-year-olds putting content out there. It doesn't always make sense. So, I think sometimes take a step back and say, okay, well, I may want this, but where do the people I'm trying to reach want to get this information? Think about it from that way instead.
So if you're a small or mid-sized manufacturer, you haven't had this background of the kind of reaching out to different audiences like you're talking about. Is it going to make sense to engage a firm like you used to work for? Should they look at other avenues? What's the best way to start exploring that whole world if you're not familiar with it? Yeah.
So I think it depends on, I thought about this a lot when you sent this question to me in advance. I'm not going to lie, because it is, it's hard. It's hard if that's not something you think about every day. It's hard if that's not your bread and butter for your career to think about communications. And so I guess there's two options that I thought about. There's one, yes, you can engage a firm like a public relations agency of some kind that is going to have a cost associated with it. So you have to decide what your budget is and if you have that space. If not, there's a lot of universities that have communications programs. I think most of them do. And a lot of times, like I remember when I was in school, you have a final project your senior year of college. And a lot of times they'll work with a local company to help do a communications plan for them. And that's free because the college students get to learn and then you get PR from it. So I think that's a way that I would approach it if you just want to get your toes wet and see like, hey, does this work for me? That's not an avenue I think a lot of people would think about, but I'm sure you could reach out to a local, check on in Detroit, it would be Wayne State, check on their website, see who runs a communications program. And, at the end of the day, you're not just going to get those students. There's always a professor who generally has, quite a bit of comms experience to be teaching it.
Right.
They'll work with the students and make sure that you get a built out comms plan that you get to then use at the end, or they'll help you do it.
Yep.
So I think that's a unique way to kind of feel that world out a bit.
That's interesting. Yeah, I never even would have thought about that. And it is a whole new world to so many people. I mean, I was in manufacturing for 30 years before I got into this, and mentioned earlier, I got into writing and thinking, how am I going to come up with article ideas? Well, now, geez, I'm getting 24 pitches a day sometimes from PR people. Yep. So they're out there beating the bushes trying to get their clients that kind of attention. Exactly. Just like you used to do.
Exactly. Now I just do it for one company, not different
Right.
clients. Yes, exactly. And it's tricky because you got to think about it. It is a whole new world, and you got to think about so many different things. Like, as I said, who's going to care about this? Why are they going to care about it? I would just encourage people to think about the how to meet people where they're at, and then the what's in it for me, the with them. I know that's usually a sales term, but I think it makes a lot of sense here as well. Like, why should people care about this?
Yep.
We may, as a company or whatever company you work for, care about something deeply, but it may not necessarily be something that your stakeholders or whoever you're trying to talk to will care about. So think about, like, maybe there's a bigger story that you can tell and fit that piece into it, but it may not be a standalone story, whether that's for a newsletter, for a report, or anything like that. So think about the what's in it for me too, because sometimes that can be tricky as well.
Well, and so that kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier around, some of those people weren't your clients, but they got to you through these agencies. So that's another angle as well, right? You mentioned the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and Pure Michigan, which are both advocacy groups here in our state. But those are everywhere, right? You can find people who are going to be doing that kind of work no matter where you are.
Exactly. There's always an advocacy group, whether it's, Economic Development Corporation, if it's a small business association. I think that's really important for manufacturers to think about. I'm sure there's different organizations that are a part of that can say, hey, send us some information. If we tell a story, then we can, think about you for that. And I think that's definitely a good way to go.
Mm-hmm. What about, it's just a crazy, dynamic world when it comes to just the media outlets, right? How do people even begin to keep up with that when they're also trying to run a manufacturing operation?
That's a good point. There's a lot of news out there, and it's hard to keep up. It's hard to wrangle all of it. I'm a big fan of Google Alerts. So I set up Google Alerts for what is important to me, or if there's a reporter that I'm like following a little bit to see what their stories are about. I highly recommend that. So if you're interested in a specific kind of manufacturing, it's very easy to set up free Google Alerts, and then you can it'll pop up and it'll populate stories that match that topic. So if you're only interested in manufacturing skis, I'm sure that you won't get a lot of Google Alerts, but you can sign up for them. And then every time a story comes up, then you'll just automatically get the reporter, the outlet, and things like that. So it's a very easy way to say, oh, well, this person is interested in something that I have to say. And that's a really easy way to keep up on news that's relevant to you, and then also to keep up on outlets and who's talking about what that might tie to your world a bit. Because there is a lot of stuff out there and it's really hard to keep track. I also recommend following any outlet on Twitter, and you can set up reminders for people to check their pages. And it is tricky, but I honestly think Google Alerts are a good way to go.
Yeah, and clearly, what you left unsaid there is if you're in manufacturing any size, shape, or form, you've got to have Google Alerts set up for Jim Vinosky.
Absolutely, yeah. When Jim writes something, pop it up. Perfect, done.
Cool. So you've done the agency thing. You've done the all for one big company, which I don't think we even talked about it. So we touched on DTE being an energy company, but tell us a little more about what DTE does, because obviously we have viewers who are outside of Michigan may not know.
Right, that's a good point. So DTE is a Detroit-based energy company. There's electric and gas throughout the state of Michigan. And I work for the corporate social responsibility arm right now, but they employ 10,000 plus people around the state of Michigan and some outside of the state too. We're working on renewable energies for a cleaner, greener future, and we have net zero goals. And it's a very strong forward-thinking company, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
And so, we've touched on some of the kind of guidance for manufacturers and what they can learn from your knowledge. You've had an interesting path yourself, like you said, coming from parents who were more in my world. I'm an engineer. And then you're off in this communications direction. What about if there are people out there who kind of find your background interesting? What should they go explore? What should they be looking at to see if this is an opportunity for them?
To see if communications is an opportunity for them?
Yeah. Communications, PR.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of local organizations like PRSA, and like that's a big one. It's Public Relations Society of America. There's little local groups that you can join. Some of them you have to pay for, others are free, but even still, you can go look on their websites and see what are they talking about? What are the skills required? What looks interesting? I think that's really important, because then you're talking with a bunch of communications people about something. And sometimes they have events that are free or paid, but then you can kind of learn what's going on. And sometimes, they'll put on events, which I guess this is important for manufacturers to even think about too. You can go to these resources and see what these comms people are talking about. But sometimes there's events where they talk about crisis communications, and of course, no one ever wants to think about that, but it's interesting, and you should be prepared for a crisis, unfortunately. So I would say checking out local chapters of public relations societies is a good way to start if you don't want to formally get any education right away and you just want to test it out. That's a really good place to go.
I love what you said about the crisis thing. So, I spent about half my career with General Mills, and I can tell you the communications folks there, they were ready for anything. I went through a couple of fires and some other, kind of dicey situations. And one of the first calls you always made was to the corporate communications group, because they knew how to handle that and make sure that we weren't missing things, getting bad news out there that wasn't accurate. So it's a critical role that I think a lot of people just don't know about or fail to think about.
Right. No one wants to think about worst case scenario. I know my boyfriend jokes. He's like, you always think about the worst case scenario when we do an activity. There's always in the back of your head. And I'm like, I know. Like, I don't want the worst case scenario to happen. But, when you're in communications and someone comes to you with an idea and says, hey, we really want to talk about XYZ. And you say, okay, cool. You automatically go through the best case scenario to the worst case scenario. So you can kind of have something in place for no matter what happens. So now I just kind of naturally do it. I mean, no, I don't need a worst case scenario when I go to the grocery store, but it's still in the back of my head. And I think having a crisis plan set up is important. And I don't think if we're talking communications, it needs to be the first thing that is done for a smaller company, but it's something to consider, because unfortunately accidents happen. Right. If there's a recall in manufacturing and that has to go out, you have to communicate with people about that. And it's good to have a plan in place for if something bad happens, which hopefully it doesn't, but.
Well, a plan in place and people who are responsible for it, right?
Right, exactly.
It's easy to drop the ball otherwise when you're focused on, maybe literally fighting a fire.
Exactly. And that's not your first train of thought. So you give it to a comms person, you say, here's the information we have, go with it. And, I know we have, at my current job, we have like a, 20-page document for different, what if this happens? What if this happens? And gosh, there's a lot of what ifs that can happen. And it's a little scary when you think about it, but it's important to have those in place.
Yep, definitely. Very cool. This is a fascinating discussion, because it's taken us in ways even I didn't anticipate.
I know, right?
So one thing I definitely want to hear, because we've touched on your background, is then, when you think off in the future, where does your career lead you? What are you thinking about?
That's a big question. I love what I do now. No matter what, I would love to stay in communications. I know that that's something I like. It's a challenge. It's always different every day. I really like communications. I think that there's a lot of options now with the virtual world. I'm working from home. I'm coming to you live from my living room. So, maybe I'll be live from my living room with another company one day. I don't really know that, but I do. I've lived in Detroit for 7 years now. I'm a big fan of Detroit in the city. So I think if there's any way I can stay here and give back and be a part of the city, and I'd like to do that, but I'm not really sure. I haven't decided yet. I just know I want to be in communications. I love it. I love the challenges it brings. I love the people I get to meet who I wouldn't have met otherwise. It's a lot of fun. So I know comms is going to be in my future. I'm just not sure in what capacity.
Cool. And there's a lot going on in Detroit these days. So there's going to be more
Yes.
opportunities, right?
Absolutely. I mean, within the past, couple of years, it's been a little quiet down here with COVID, but
Yeah.
it's picking back up. It's a beautiful city. It's home to so many large companies. And then you get all these events like auto show every fall. And well, I
Mhm.
guess now in the fall it's going to be, but there's a lot of cool stuff going on down here. So I like being a part of it.
What are you seeing that's new around Detroit? I know mobility is big all over the state, and clearly that has to be hitting home there in the heart of transportation. But what else are you seeing coming down the pike?
Yeah, so mobility is obviously big. I think that small businesses obviously everywhere small businesses kind of took a pause during COVID, but I think you're starting to see some of that come back. And, you've seen a lot of restaurants make it through the hard times. I've even seen some restaurants opening up recently. And I think
Good.
people are talking about how to make this city like a cleaner, more beautiful place. And there's a lot of ways you can talk about that, whether it's clean, green energy, whether it's, beautification of neighborhoods. Detroit is a really big space. So there's a lot of things to work on, but I think it's getting there.
Cool. When you think about that communications future, surely you've got to be thinking about how you are in the future going to get back to feeding me stories, right?
Of course, that's got to be a part of it. My next role, I'm going to be like, listen, if I can't talk to Jim, I'm not taking this. I'm not going to work here.
Yep.
No, I do miss working with you on the stories because, as I said, I would talk about volunteerism and the foundation work. And while it's beautiful work, it's not really relevant to you right now.
No, I understand.
Although there might be in the future.
We did touch on one before we got recording, so there could be some cool stuff coming. We'll see.
Yes. And I know the
awesome.
other comms people who work on stuff that you might be interested in. So I can always hook you up with those people.
Yep. Well, one of your former coworkers and I are currently working on a piece.
Fantastic. Yeah. I know who you're talking about. And that's the other thing, is like, it's good. You meet one person and then I have other colleagues in comms. So I can say, oh, well, this is a good fit for this reporter, or this Jim would like this. And it's fun how all these things work out.
Well, and another piece you touched on, I didn't want to forget, is you talked about, enjoying getting out with people where you took them on tours through the state, different areas. And that's how we finally met face to face, which is where I also met this coworker of yours who I'm potentially working with. So let's touch on that. You wound up doing a piece on, or a bit of work on mobility, and you pulled me into that.
I did. So with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, there was the MEDC for short. We did a business mobility trip where we took, some reporters and around the state. And when we were on the west side of the state, I was like, Jim is on the west side of the state. And I finally met, I think we'd worked together for a year at that point, and we finally met in person, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. But so, that whole trip was to showcase what's happening in this state. What are we talking about with the future of mobility? How is this going to impact cities? When it comes to even manufacturing, how are we going to change the manufacturing plants? How are we going to retool? How are we going to retrain people? There's a lot to think about with that. So that mobility trip was pretty cool. We finally got to meet. That
was fun. Yeah. Met some other very cool people. And it's so funny the way the world works today. Even, that was pre-COVID, right? Where, like you said, we worked together for a year and hadn't met face to face. There's plenty of people I've been working with now for years who, we've never seen each other.
I know, it's wild. And like that, I know I talked about bringing people on trips, and that's a unique way to showcase what's going on. But in this COVID future that we're looking at and the current state, I'd encourage people, it's not always, you don't always have to bring someone somewhere because that's an expense that you have to incur and someone has to fund that. But, you can always do a virtual tour of something. You can set up videos. iPhones are incredible nowadays. Like, you can capture a really good video if you want to share that with a reporter and say, hey, this is what I'm talking about. Here's how it works. You don't necessarily have to bring people places anymore. We're all getting used to doing things from our living rooms.
So you just got me thinking about another tangent, and, you touched on engaging with local schools and getting maybe some free help that way in the PR world. But even if you have small manufacturers who are thinking about what you were just talking about, doing some video, doing some kind of recording. I know it took me quite a while, and just sheer necessity to get this web show going. And I had to learn a lot along the way, but there are people out there who will come in and do that as part of their classwork.
Yeah, people
So
will
if
do
you're
this for their
intimidated
classwork.
by it, you don't need to be.
Yep. And even like, it's a learning experience for them. But, if people are in school, it's, they'll either teach you how to fish, as I like to say, or, they'll do it for you, maybe if it's for a class and they get to use it in a portfolio too. So I would urge people to think about schools because it's a win-win at that point. Or, I'm a big fan of YouTube tutorials. If I'm not sure how to do something, look it up, figure out how to, it's better to hold your iPhone sideways than vertically if you're taking a video for social. It's those little things that you can learn. And we've all got with mini computers in our hands nowadays. And so you can really do a lot on your own that doesn't have a lot of cost to share what you're doing. Yeah.
So that's a message I definitely want the people who see this, who are, more from my world, the old school manufacturers who may not have dabbled in this stuff like I have, is get out there and do it. I mean, this is the future. Yeah. You mentioned YouTube tutorials. Those things are magical. What did we even do before those came along?
I don't know. I mean, I had to look up a YouTube video when I put together an IKEA table a couple months ago. And it's those instructions will get you. So I'm just, there's a video on how to do everything out there. So, it takes time to educate yourself, but if, communicating or setting up a blog or social media is something that you're passionate about or you want to do as a manufacturer, I'd encourage people to sit down and kind of look at, what's important to you and then how you can position it. If it's worth a video, how easy it is to do by yourself. If you need to write something, that's when you might want to reach out to a professional or a college. And there's so many tools and options out there. I think that everyone can communicate things. It's just, challenging to get started sometimes.
It is. Yeah. And that gets me thinking back to Stormy Cromer, because I think that's one company, again, a small company up in Ironwood, Michigan, which is, I think, about 6,000 people now in the biggest town around for 100 miles in any direction. Yeah. And they are doing phenomenal stuff when it comes to, whether it's this kind of just straightforward PR stuff, the social media stuff, getting their brand out there. And it's become kind of this iconic thing well beyond the borders when Bob Jackworth bought the company back 30 years ago when it was going out of business. So that's the other thing too, is you go out and engage. And I think you'll prove to yourself that this stuff not only is worth doing, it actually will pay for itself and then some.
Right. And that's very true. And I think it's actually worth bringing up is sometimes people want to say, okay, so let's say what is the return on investment? What is the ROI on this? If I place a story if you and I work together on a story about manufacturing, do you see sales go up after that? You don't always see an immediate result, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think that that's something to ignore. You may see, it depends on what you're selling, right? If you're selling a product, then if you place a story somewhere, you will see product sales spike after that, right? But that's not necessarily the only benefit to communications is just sales or just selling something and making a profit. Obviously that's the end goal. Everyone wants to make money in a business, but it's also talking about your brand, which is really important to build that image of yourself saying hey, this is who we are. This is what we stand for. And putting that out there so that in the future, people think of you in a positive way or think of you in the way that you'd like them to think of you. So I know that's kind of a confusing thing to say, hey, it may not immediately give you money, but it will in the long run. And it plays into that role in the long run.
Yeah, I can second that. I mean, certainly with some of the stuff I've done, sometimes it's slow out of the gates, but you plug away at it, you get it out there on your social media, you get it in front of people, you build your network around it, and it's amazing over time what it'll build into. Exactly. Well, cool. Anything else, Aimee? What haven't we touched on that we should chat about?
I think we talked about a lot of things. We covered a lot. I think the only thing I might add is, because I find myself doing this and I want to make sure to encourage everyone to think about this, is don't use too much jargon in whatever you do, because people may not always understand you. And I think that's the only thing I didn't say that I would encourage people to think about. Even if you're talking B2B, one manufacturer to a distributor or someone who's going to purchase your product, they may not know the words that you'd like to think they will, but I'd like to encourage people to stay away from jargon. It gets really confusing. And if you're not going to hire a comms person to filter that out, or, then when you're doing it yourself, make sure to ask yourself, would my 10-year-old niece or nephew understand this? yes, that's a little extreme, but put it through that lens when you communicate something.
So it's very interesting because that's another avenue where our worlds have somewhat converged. My company that I launched a year ago, that's one of those things that's in a slow build, Cosgrove Content, where that's what we do. I mean, we work with people who are the gung-ho in the trenches manufacturers who know all this technical stuff, and they can't convey it themselves for a generic audience, and they struggle to find people who do. And that's a great point, because you have to. Even like you say, you're dealing with other manufacturers. You could well be dealing with, administrative people who have no idea what you're talking about, and yet you're a key resource for them. Excellent point, Aimee.
Yeah. It's important to think about. I sometimes find myself asking people on calls like, hey, can you explain this to me like I'm 10? Because if you can break it down to that level, everyone's going to understand it then.
Yep.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. Aimee Ridella, it has been every bit the joy getting back in touch that I knew it would be, and then some. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. I'm glad we could do this.
Yeah. And so, normally I would say, where do people get in touch with you? People don't have to get in touch with you, because all the people you need to work with are right there at DTE. But yeah, definitely, check out the other shows that we have here for manufacturing talks. Like I said, Aimee's definitely one of the tops, but I think the other ones are really great too. So get out there on YouTube and the podcast outlets and check us out. Thanks again, Aimee.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanoski. Watch for new episodes dropping on the first and third Tuesdays of every month.